The fog pressed in like a living thing, suffocating, and cold as Eleanor Morland stepped cautiously forward, her breath shallow in the heavy air. Around her, the lanterns on Hollow Street flickered uncertainly, their eternal glow wavering as if struggling against some unseen force. Her heart pounded in rhythm with the unsteady light. Every step weighted with dread and determination. Behind her, Thomas and Mrs. Agnes Crowley followed silently, their faces pale but resolute. They had reached the heart of the nightmare that had haunted Hollow Street for generations, the lantern wraith. A low, shifting shadow coalesced ahead, its form elusive and unstable, wreathed in flickering light and swirling mist. The wraith's presence was both terrifying and sorrowful, a spectral guardian bound to the cursed lanterns that imprisoned the street in endless night. Eleanor's sharp eyes locked onto the shadowy figure, feeling the oppressive weight of centuries-old sorrow and malevolence emanating from it. "Why do you persist?" Eleanor demanded, voice steady despite the chill crawling up her spine. "Why hold this place in darkness? Why trap innocent souls?" The wraith's form shimmered, light flickering like dying embers. Its voice, when it came, was a mournful whisper carried on the wind, tinged with anguish. "Bound by a ritual gone awry, I am both jailer and guardian. The curse was meant to imprison a greater evil, but in doing so, I was chained to these lanterns and this endless night." Eleanor listened, the weight of its confession settling heavy in her chest. The entity was no mere monster. It was a tragic remnant of a desperate past, its existence a cruel paradox. It had become the very thing it sought to contain, condemning the street and its people in an eternal twilight. Thomas shifted uneasily beside her, his youthful face drawn tight with fear and resolve. "There has to be a way to end this," he whispered, his eyes flicking nervously to the unsteady lantern light. Agnes, her voice a brittle breath, added, "The failed ritual left wounds that bleed through time. To sever the bond, a sacrifice must be made, one that is both willing and profound." Eleanor's mind raced. The cost was clear, and yet the thought of surrendering anything at all to this cursed existence was agonizing. But to do nothing was to condemn her family and the street forever. The wraith's flickering form drifted closer, its presence both suffocating and sorrowful. "You possess the courage I lack. Will you take the burden upon yourself to free us all?" Time seemed to stretch, the fog swirling in hypnotic eddies around them, the lantern's light pulsing in tandem with Eleanor's pounding heart. She reached out, her hand trembling but resolute, the weight of countless vanished souls pressing upon her. "I will," she whispered, as the wraith's form shimmered and dissolved into the mist. The lanterns flared brightly one last time before flickering uncertainly. Eleanor felt the sharp sting of sacrifice clawing at her soul, but beneath it all, a fragile hope took root. This confrontation marked the turning point, the beginning of the end for the curse that had held Hollow Street captive. Yet as Eleanor faced the dark unknown, she understood that the price of freedom was steep and the night was far from over. The fog thickened once more, swallowing the fading light. As Eleanor prepared herself for the final ordeal that would decide the fate of her family and the street she called home, the lantern wraith had spoken, and now the ultimate sacrifice awaited. Would Eleanor's courage be enough to break the chains of endless night? Or would the darkness claim her as it had so many before? The answer lay shrouded in the swirling mists, where light and shadow danced their eternal dance, waiting for dawn's fragile promise to break through. The air was thick with a suffocating silence, broken only by the faint sputtering of the lantern in Eleanor's trembling hand. The ever-burning light, once a steady guardian against the encroaching night, now flickered violently as if struggling against an unseen force. Around her, the fog writhed like a living thing, twisting and curling through the narrow cobblestone street like spectral serpents. The shadows cast by the lantern danced and stretched grotesquely, seeping into the mist and coalescing into forms that chilled Eleanor's heart. The lantern wraith was near. Eleanor's knuckles whitened as she gripped the lantern's handle tighter. The dimming glow illuminated her pale face, etched with lines of fear and resolve. Behind her, the faint outlines of Thomas and Agnes hovered at the edge of the fog, their presence a fragile tether to reality in this nightmare. Agnes clutched a worn talisman, her lips moving in a low, urgent murmur of incantation, while Thomas's restless gaze flicked between the lantern and the thickening shadows. "It's time," Eleanor whispered, voice steady despite the tempest raging within her. The street around them seemed to hold its breath, the usual cacophony of ghostly whispers now a tense hush. The lantern wraith's figure shimmered, a shifting mass of darkness interlaced with flickering light, its presence oppressive and suffocating. Eleanor could feel its gaze like icy tendrils probing her soul, weighing her worth, daring her to falter. She thought of Jacob, her lost husband, whose disappearance had haunted her every waking moment. She thought of the neighbors lost to the cursed night, their homes sealed behind shuttered windows, their fates a grim warning. And most of all, she thought of Thomas, her son, growing braver each day yet still vulnerable to the creeping darkness. Drawing a shuddering breath, Eleanor lifted the lantern higher. The flame sputtered, casting grotesque shadows that stretched like claws toward her. The whispers grew louder, angry and desperate, voices from beyond the veil crying out in protest. The lantern wraith surged forward, a storm of shadow and flickering flame. Its form both terrifying and tragic, prisoner bound to the cursed light it protected. "Eleanor, no," Agnes's voice trembled, but Eleanor shook her head. "There is no other way. If I do not extinguish this light, we remain prisoners forever." Thomas stepped closer, his youthful face set in grim determination. "I'm with you, Mother. Whatever happens." The lantern's flame danced wildly, the air thick with electric tension. Eleanor's hand reached out, fingers trembling as they brushed the glass globe. A sudden roar of spectral voices erupted around them, the fog swirling violently as the boundary between worlds thinned. Heart pounding, Eleanor closed her eyes and snuffed out the lantern's light. In that instant, a piercing silence shattered the night. The shadows recoiled, the lantern wraith's form unraveling into mist and darkness before vanishing like a nightmare at dawn. The fog began to lift, dissipating slowly to reveal the familiar outlines of hollow streets, time-worn houses, bathed in the faint glow of the first natural stars in decades. Eleanor sank to her knees, breath ragged, the weight of sacrifice pressing down like stone. Thomas knelt beside her, hands steadying her shaking form. Agnes approached, her face softening with a mixture of relief and sorrow. "It is done," Agnes whispered. "The curse is broken." Eleanor's eyes opened, reflecting the starlit sky above and the fragile hope it carried. Yet within her, a quiet darkness lingered, the cost of freedom etched deep into her soul. As dawn approached, the survivors of Hollow Street gathered silently, their faces marked by loss and tentative hope. The endless night was over, but the memory of its shadows would haunt them forever. Outside, the last flicker of the cursed lantern's light died, leaving Hollow Street to finally rest in the embrace of true darkness and the promise of a new day. The sacrifice was complete, but the question remained. Had Eleanor truly freed them all, or merely delayed the inevitable return of the darkness? The night held its secrets close, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. The hour was unlike any Hollow Street had witnessed in decades. For so long, the street had been imprisoned beneath a suffocating veil of fog, the eternal glow of lanterns casting a cursed light that never faltered, never faded. Yet now, as the first faint blush of dawn tinged the horizon, a transformation stirred in the very air, subtle, hesitant, but irrevocable. Eleanor Morland stood by the window of her modest parlor, her breath fogging the cold glass as she gazed out onto the street below. The fog, once a dense, unmoving shroud, had begun to thin, retreating like a reluctant tide. She could hear a tentative bird call, a fragile melody that seemed almost foreign after years of silence. The lantern outside her home, the very same that had begun to dim those many nights ago, flickered once more. Then, as if releasing its final breath, the flame extinguished completely. A hush fell over Hollow Street. The perpetual twilight that had defined every waking moment seemed to lift, replaced by the soft, natural glow of dawn. The lingering mist caught the early light, sparkling like fragile crystal beads, and the scent of damp earth and old stone filled the morning air. Eleanor's heart pounded with a mixture of relief and a sorrow so deep it felt like an ache in her bones. Thomas appeared in the doorway behind her, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Mother, it's really dawn, the fog's lifting." She nodded, unable to speak at first, then whispered, "It's over, Thomas. The curse is broken." Together, they stepped outside, their footsteps echoing softly on the worn cobblestones. The street, once a ghostly tunnel of shadows and mist, was revealing its true face: cracked paving stones, creeping ivy, and gardens overrun with wildflowers and weeds. Neighbors, their faces etched with exhaustion and disbelief, began emerging from shuttered homes. Martha Griggs shuffled forward, her trembling hands clutching a shawl tighter around her frail shoulders. "Is it true?" Martha asked, voice quivering, the nights lifting. Eleanor smiled gently, placing a steadying hand on the elderly woman's arm. "Yes, Martha, the night is finally ending." Down the street, Samuel Hargrove moved among the gathering crowd, notebook in hand, his youthful energy a sharp contrast to the weariness around him. He paused to speak with Agnes Crowley, who stood quietly holding a small, unlit candle. The old woman's eyes, sharp and bright despite her years, filled with tears as she struck a match and lit the wick, the flame dancing softly in the morning light. "A new beginning," Agnes murmured, her voice thick with emotion. The street filled with a gentle murmur of voices, tentative greetings, whispered prayers, and stories of loss. Eleanor felt the weight of years settle around her, mingling with a fragile hope. There was much to mourn: the neighbors who never returned, the friends swallowed by the fog, and the countless nights spent in fearful vigil beneath the lantern's cursed glow. Yet, beneath the sorrow, a pulse of resilience beat strong. Hands clasped, eyes met, and in that fragile community, a tentative promise took root to rebuild, to remember, and to face the coming days together. As the sun rose higher, casting warm gold across the street's worn facades, Eleanor returned inside. She sat at her desk and opened her journal, the familiar weight of pen in hand grounding her. She began to write, her words flowing like a balm to her weary soul, reflections on sacrifice, on the price of forbidden knowledge, and on the enduring strength of those who had survived the endless night. Outside, the last tendrils of fog curled and faded into the waking light. But even as dawn bathed Hollow Street in warmth, Eleanor's gaze drifted to the shadows beneath the old lantern posts. There, faint wisps lingered, ghosts of the past, reminders that some darkness never fully disappears. The story of Hollow Street was far from over. "We have survived," Eleanor whispered to the quiet room, "and now we must live." The dawn's light promised a new chapter, one of healing, of reckoning, and of hope. But the shadows would remain, etched forever in the memories of those who had endured the cursed light and the endless night it cast. And in those shadows, Eleanor knew the true test of their resilience was only just beginning. The morning light that spilled tentatively onto Hollow Street was unlike anything the residents had seen in decades. As the fog lifted, revealing the worn cobblestones and shuttered windows, a fragile silence hung in the air, a silence filled not with peace, but with the weight of absence. Eleanor Morland stood at the threshold of her home, her sharp eyes tracing the contours of the street bathed in an unaccustomed glow. The ever-burning lanterns had finally extinguished, their cursed light replaced by the natural dawn. Yet, the liberation felt incomplete. Her gaze drifted toward the empty houses, the spaces once occupied by neighbors who had vanished into the endless night. The hollow echoes of their lives lingered like ghosts, their absence a stark reminder of the price paid for freedom. Eleanor's heart clenched, a muted ache that no light could dispel. She turned inward, reflecting on the sacrifices that had brought them here, the sacrifices of loved ones, the burdens borne silently, and the fragile hope that now fluttered in the morning air. Inside the Morland household, the atmosphere was thick with a different tension. Thomas sat hunched over the small wooden table, his tousled brown hair falling over his serious eyes. The relief that once shone in his gaze had dimmed, replaced by a restlessness that mirrored Eleanor's own turmoil. The boy's fingers traced absent patterns on the worn surface, his mind wrestling with the scars left by the curse. "Mother," he began hesitantly, voice trembling with conflicting emotions, "do you think we can ever really be free, after everything?" Eleanor met his eyes, her own weary yet resolute. "Freedom isn't just about the curse ending, Thomas. It's about what we do with what's left, the memories, the pain, and the choices ahead." Their conversation stretched into the dimming light of the evening, a delicate dance of frustration, love, and vulnerability. Thomas wrestled with the loss of innocence and the burden of knowledge, while Eleanor grappled with the guilt of her decisions and the hope of guiding her son toward healing. Outside their home, the community was stirring, tentative yet compelled to face the new reality. A town meeting was convened in the old community hall space that had long been silent, now filled with the voices of survivors. Faces etched with exhaustion and grief gathered, some shadowed by blame, others brightened by cautious optimism. Martha Griggs, trembling hands clutching her shawl, spoke softly of the nights spent barricaded indoors, the terror of unseen watchers in the fog. Samuel Hargrove, his sharp features marked by sleepless nights of investigation, challenged the crowd to confront the truths that had long been buried beneath superstition and fear. The meeting became a crucible of shared sorrow and tentative hope. Accusations mingled with apologies. Memories of vanished neighbors were honored alongside plans for rebuilding. The community, fractured by decades of isolation and dread, began the slow, painful process of healing. Meanwhile, in the quiet seclusion of her home, Agnes Crowley sat among her strange talismans and fading parchments, her silver hair pulled into a tight bun. Her sharp eyes reflected the dim light of a single candle as she clutched a worn amulet close to her chest. The weight of her family's tragic legacy settled heavily upon her shoulders. Agnes's mind wandered to her daughter Lydia, lost to the fog years ago, a symbol of the stakes and sorrow that the curse had wrought. The failed ritual that had bound the lantern wraith haunted her still, a reminder of the fine line between protection and imprisonment. Yet despite the cost, Agnes bore her knowledge with quiet dignity, resolved to aid the street's fragile rebirth in whatever way she could. As night fell once more, the natural darkness of the world returned to Hollow Street, unadorned by cursed light. Eleanor stood by the window, watching the stars emerge in the clear sky. The phantoms and the fog had vanished, but their memory lingered in every shadow and whisper. Her journal lay open on the desk, pages filled with the chronicles of fear, courage, and sacrifice. The story of Hollow Street was far from over. It was a story of resilience, the resilience of a community that had endured unending night and now faced the daunting dawn. Eleanor's thoughts turned to the future, uncertain yet unyielding. The legacy of the curse would remain etched in the hearts of those who survived. But so too would the lessons learned, the bonds forged in darkness, and the fragile hope that true light could one day fully return. And so, as the last lanterns lay cold and dark, the people of Hollow Street stepped forward into a world reshaped by loss and illuminated by the first fragile rays of a new day. But the shadows of the past were never fully gone, and Eleanor knew that the price of forbidden knowledge was a burden that might never truly lift. The night had ended, but its echoes would haunt the street and her soul for years to come. With a deep breath, Eleanor closed her journal and prepared to face whatever dawn would bring next. Her resolve, tempered by sorrow and hope, intertwined. The last lantern sputtered once, twice, and then was gone. It was a quiet extinguishing, almost imperceptible save for the faintest sigh of wind that swept through Hollow Street, pushing the ever-present fog aside like a curtain drawn back to reveal a stage long hidden in darkness. Eleanor Moreland stood in the middle of the cobblestone road, her eyes fixed on the place where the lantern had burned so steadfastly for as long as she could remember. Now, for the first time in decades, natural light spilled into the street, soft, golden, and trembling with the tentative promise of dawn. She breathed in deeply, the cool morning air tasting faintly of wet earth and distant rain, a stark contrast to the stale, oppressive stillness that had choked Hollow Street for so long. The silence was profound, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves and the occasional drip of dew from the eaves of shuttered houses. The fog that had clung to the street like a living thing was thinning, revealing the worn facades of the Victorian homes scarred by time and terror. Eleanor's heart was heavy, weighed down by the memories that the lifting mist brought with it. The vanished families, the whispered warnings, the nights spent in fearful vigil beside the flickering lantern, they all lingered like shadows beneath the rising sun. Her fingers tightened around the leather-bound journal she carried everywhere, the pages filled with her painstaking accounts of the curse, the phantoms, and the sacrifices made. Inside the Moreland home, a fragile peace settled. Thomas sat near the window, his eyes wide as they adjusted to the brightness seeping through the glass. The shadows that had once seemed to curl and writhe in every corner were gone, replaced by the gentle illumination of dawn. He looked out at the street, his expression a mixture of awe and uncertainty, as if the world itself had shifted beneath his feet. "Do you think it's really over?" he asked quietly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them like a fragile thread. Eleanor turned to him, her gaze soft yet resolute. "I believe it is. The curse that held us prisoner has been broken. But the scars it left, those will remain for a long time." Across the street, the door to Mrs. Agnes Crowley's home creaked open. The frail woman stepped out, her silver hair pulled into a tight bun, eyes sharp despite her years. She approached slowly, leaning on her cane, and stopped beside Eleanor and Thomas. "It is over," Agnes said, voice low but steady. "The price was high, but the curse has ended. Hollow Street will never be the same, but there is hope now." Eleanor nodded, feeling the weight of Agnes's words settle around them. They stood together in the quiet morning, the ghosts of the past whispering just beyond the edges of their vision. The street was free, yes, but the memories, the endless night, the cursed light, the phantoms and the fog, those would endure in the hearts of those who survived. As the sun climbed higher, the residents of Hollow Street began to emerge from their homes, blinking against the unfamiliar brightness, faces etched with grief and tentative hope. The long nightmare was over, but the journey to healing had only just begun. Eleanor closed her journal and looked once more down the street, where the last lantern's faint glow had faded into nothingness. She whispered a prayer to the lost, to the brave, and to the future. May we never forget the price of light. And with that, the shadows receded, and Hollow Street stepped into a dawn it had not known for generations.